This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's morning break on Teachers Talk Radio with me, Holly King-Mand. This week we're talking to home educators about how and why they do what they do and what we can learn from them. Grab yourself a cup of tea, get ready to listen into the conversation.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Good morning, listeners, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. So this week, as I said, we are talking to home educators. Are any of you home educators? Have you come from classroom teaching to teaching your own children at home? Have you been entirely put off by the prospect of teaching your own children around the kitchen table post-pandemic? Or is it something that maybe some students in your class, their parents are thinking of doing? What are the reasons that those children and their families are thinking of doing that? It's a very complex and loaded conversation, not least because of the recent schools bill, which by all accounts seem to have been put on a long-term hold, which can only be a good thing. But we are joined today by two home educators that have chosen to educate their children at home for two entirely different reasons. And it seems to be working out brilliantly for them. Their children are thriving and really enjoying learning. And as parents, and both of them, both sets of parents as teachers, are also really enjoying the experience of teaching their own children at home. Me personally, I find doing the homework with my own children challenging enough, but I can see the thrill in having that really wide, open discovery approach to learning. And maybe there is something that we can learn from these home educators about how we approach teaching and learning in the classroom. So first of all, I'm joined by KJ, and I'm now joined by KJ, who is a home educator herself. And KJ, thank you for coming to talk to Teachers Talk Radio today about your home education experience. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your children and why you made the decision to home educate them?
Right, well, we first started looking into home education when I was pregnant with my first, so super early on in our parenting journey. Excuse me. My husband at the time was looking at a career in professional sports that was going to have him traveling a lot. And I just didn't want to be left at home with the children all the time. So home educating meant that we could travel together. We weren't bound to school holidays. We could get schoolwork done wherever he was working, and basically wanted to keep us together as a family unit. As it happened, he had a catastrophic injury and ended up going into teaching himself.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, so he's an assistant head at a local school. And we just kind of already made the decision to home educate at that point. And the more we got embedded in the home education community, the more we were like, this is the right choice for our kids. Initially, we'd only planned to do it for maybe till they were 7, and then we kind of went, just for primary, and it very quickly became a lifestyle. We've always said to the children, you can attend school if you want to, and interestingly, my 12-year-old has just found a school that she thinks she might be interested in, but my 14-year-old is pretty adamant that he is still wanting to be home educated currently.
Okay, so this is a really this will be a really nice perspective, because lots of the home educators that I've spoken to have had really like negative experiences at school, or their child has an additional need that they don't feel can be accommodated by a school. So this is an interesting perspective because you've come to this from just purely from a practicality angle, I guess, to start with.
Yeah, definitely. And that's not to say that some of the other issues don't exist as well. So as it happens, I'm autistic and have ADHD. We didn't know it when we chose to home educate, but both of our children are autistic. And my son, they're querying a diagnosis of ADHD currently. So potentially, had they gone to school, we might have run into the same problems as some of the other parents.
So you may have come to this right from the other side.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But overwhelmingly, we've found the flexibility with home education and being able to tailor your child's learning, being able to work with them on their strengths, and then, perhaps helping support them with their weaknesses. But that individualized approach of support has meant that our children have generally thrived. Much to the surprise of many of the professionals working with them, they've achieved far more than they were expected to, purely, I think, because we have that holistic, integrated, there isn't a separation of work and home life. So it's not like they're being taught something at school and parents at home are undermining it, or vice versa. It's that continuous lifestyle education that, wrap around consistency, which, for kids with, particularly children who are autistic, that consistency when they're young is so important. So yeah, we, like you say, we potentially would have come here anyway, but we haven't had any adverse school experiences. And we lived and worked in a school for 15 years, and we love education. My husband still works in a school. I run a business providing computing workshops for primary schools. So we're not anti-school in any way at all.
That's really, like I say, that's really interesting because it will be different to a lot of the stories that we're going to hear on Teachers Talk Radio today. So what does home education look like for your family? Because I hear stories, and I follow lots of home educators on social media, and for some of them, it's almost like replicating school, but at home. And for others, it's a lot more sort of seamlessly, like you were saying, part of, a continual lifestyle of learning at home. But what does it manifest like in your household?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that if you asked me at any 12-month period in our journey, you would have got a completely different answer.
Really?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating because home education, like you say, it does look so different in different families. But I've been running one of the largest Christian home educating networking groups in the UK for 12 years now.
Wow.
And well, as part of a team, but you do find there are some people who are very strong advocates for one particular style of home ed. They don't always stay there. And so I believe very much in adapting learning to children, right? And so certainly when my children were younger, they loved a workbook. They were excited to get their geography book out and colour in the map and answer the questions in quizzes. As they've got older, that style of learning feels very condescending. And what I think is interesting in the home ed community is children, because they mix with different age groups quite naturally, there isn't this, you were born in this year, so you stick with children from this year. They do tend to have relationships that are older and younger than themselves, and they don't see peers as necessarily age boundaried, but more subject or interest boundaried. And so they think nothing of having, a granny from next door as their best friend for a while, because we both happen to be really into crochet at the minute.
It's a lovely positive to come
it
from
is. And some of my daughter's best friends, like 3 years younger than her, but they've got a shared love of Animal Crossing. And so they don't seem to restrict themselves in relationships, and that means that because they're mixing with lots of different age groups, they do seem to, in some ways, mature more slowly, and in other ways mature more quickly. And so the idea of handing out a workbook and testing my children now feels a bit condescending. They learn in the same ways I learn. If they want to know about something, they open up a laptop and ask Google, or they might look on YouTube for a video about something that they want to revise. Like, they're less likely to want a workbook, or it's very rare that we do a sort of lecturing teaching style with them. We do a lot of learning through discovery. So one of the things, I've got some new robotics kits that I'm taking into primary schools, and my children have just really enjoyed playing with the software. And rather than teaching them programming, I'll show them a couple of basics and then just leave them alone with it. And kids are far more creative. They find things
them credit for, yeah.
Yeah, they find things that I didn't even have on the lesson plan, and I go, oh, that's a good idea, I'll add that. They do just come up with things by themselves if we kind of give them the space to do that. And that's the part that I think is difficult in a large classroom. And so one of the benefits of home education is smaller group sizes. So even if we do an activity with friends, we tend to keep the group sizes a lot smaller. So it's far easier to differentiate than it would be if we had a class with 30 children in it.
Yeah, I suppose their individual needs are not getting lost in a class of 30.
Yeah, exactly. And it's far easier for them to communicate to us what support needs they have, and for us to meet those support needs.
Do you think home educated children are better at asking for help because they're often learning in smaller groups?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
It's a big question, isn't it? Because even as I asked I thought, well, maybe the flip side of that too.
I've got two answers for you for this, and one is that children who've never been to school, yes, I think they are better at advocating for themselves. They are used to having their voices heard and having their needs met, and so there's not that resistance to asking for something and being told that either it's not available or put your hand down, we're doing something else right now. Children who come to home ed having been in a school, and this isn't to say all school children will experience this, but children who come to home ed from school, it's usually because they've had an adverse school experience, right? If everything's going brilliantly at your child's school, you don't pull them out to home educate. So if they've had an adverse experience in school, that has usually included not feeling like their needs are getting met, not feeling like their voice is being heard. And so if the child feels like, well, there's no point asking, I just get told to be quiet or to wait, or it's not talking time or whatever, then they're less likely to voice their needs because they don't think that need's going to be met. However, I was in a school yesterday and I saw the most amazing thing. The classroom teacher, as they were doing roll call, had the children calling out numbers. And I was like, what are these numbers about? And he was writing them down. And it dawned on me as we kept going that the higher the number, the more happy and engaged and excited the child seemed to be. And the lower the number, the more withdrawn the child was. And then we got to the end and he said, just before Coach KJ starts, we've got a couple of low numbers in the room. Can we just do some quick sorries and thank yous? It sounds like something's gone wrong at lunchtime. And these hands shot up all over the room, and children started publicly and specifically apologising to one another for things that had happened at lunchtime, and then forgiving each other. And I just thought, what an amazing culture there is in that school, that children feel safe to admit publicly, I did this wrong, what I've done wasn't okay. And there's no fear of, I'm going to be told off or disciplined, that they're just encouraged to apologise. And I think that's something that, if I could bring one thing from the home ed community into schools, it would be creating that safe space where children know that it's okay to make a mistake, we apologise and we can move on, but it's safe for them to admit, I don't know, I don't understand, or I did this wrong, without fear of discipline that is going to be.
Yeah, I think there is a big fear for children in school that there's going to be some sort of punishment or sanction if they do something wrong. Out of curiosity, was it a church school or not? Just because my children go to a church school, and there's a lot more emphasis on apologising and forgiveness than I've experienced in any of the schools that I've worked in.
Yeah, interesting. It was a church school that they are. That I hadn't clocked that, but I'm just thinking back to the name of the school, and it does have CE in it, so I'm guessing it's a Church of England school.
So when I asked about how home education manifests in your household, I'm always curious, because I have some of the lovely Instagram families, home ed families that I follow. They have these really gorgeous, like, not quite a classroom, but a space for dedicated learning. Do you have that in your house, or does it just happen everywhere and anywhere? And
when my children were young, we did have a dedicated schoolroom. That was largely because we were living in a school, and I needed a living room that was presentable for adults to come into, and one that was chaos with all their craft projects and their Lego and their whatever constructs Kepler planks. They used to absolutely love building huge Kepler plank construction projects. And just one of the worst things for creativity is telling them, stop now, it's time to tidy up. Because they're just frustrated if they don't get to finish the project, but also, like, nothing's ever finished. When you're building or creating, nothing's ever finished. There's always more you can do. And so allowing them the freedom of, you never have to tidy away something you're working on in this room, was a huge luxury that we had. My sister was home educating her own children as well at the time down the road. We used to do lots of things together. And I know that that was something that she really struggled with, because they were using their dining table, their kitchen table, as their home ed space as well. And it meant that 3 times a day they had to clear everything up so that they could eat. And that's a lot harder for a family to manage. So we were very blessed that we had that opportunity to have a separate space. We no longer have a separate space. That isn't something that we needed once our kids got beyond the stage of building huge Connects projects. Now that they tend to be working a bit more at desktop computers or on iPads and things, they just do that wherever they feel comfortable. And so sometimes that's in the garden in the summer. It might be at the kitchen table whilst I'm cooking, or it might be in the living room or in their bedrooms. We're kind of flexible about where we're working now.
Wonderful. And what would you say are the major difficulties that the home education community and home educators themselves face?
One would definitely be financial constraints. I know that a lot of, I'm fortunate that I've always been able to work around my children, because I was self-employed or employed by the school that we lived in. So it was easy to work around having my children with me. That isn't the case in most families, which means that they become single income families. And unless your partner is earning a huge amount of money, being a single income family in the UK is tough.
And now more than ever.
Yeah, it really is. And when you add to that the fact that you are home more than you would be if you weren't home educating, so things like switching the heating off whilst you're all at school, that doesn't happen. And you might be out and about. A lot of home educators aren't actually home that much in the day. That's kind of a misconception. We do go out, but we might go out for 3 hours in the morning or for 3 hours in the afternoon, and that doesn't negate the fact that we were still home for a longer period than we would have been if the children were at school. And then obviously you've got the cost of all the materials and resources, tutoring clubs, so things like gymnastics and parkour lessons or riding lessons or any kind of group coaching activity. Those are all costs that have to come out of your family budget. So financial stress is usually a big deal in home ed. And then you add on to that the fact that because you've opted out of going to school, you don't get things like e-vouchers for holiday clubs or have funded clubs, so you can't get the free school meals. There's a whole load of provision that you are opting out of when you choose to deregister from a school, which it can be really, really difficult. And I know there's a huge sort of conflict over whether or not there should be a compulsory register for home education. one of these sort of arguments that is frequently thrown at home educators is, if you would register, the LA could support you better. But my experience of home education in the last 15 years is that LAs do not have the funding to support the number of home educators they have. What funding could they possibly offer home educators when they can barely fund the schools they've got and the EHCPs they've got? The idea that if we all registered, we'd bankrupt the LA. There's far too many of us for them to provide support for.
Yeah, it would need a whole lot of attention to the
I mean, even if we all
like
just returned to school tomorrow, they couldn't afford to fund the places required for the schools. The amount of funding, even without EHCPs, just the standard student funding that would be required to, you know, I know of at least 300 families in Bedford that would, if you all put them all to school tomorrow, imagine all that excess funding you'd need to find for them.
Gosh.
And then a ton of them would have EHCPs. Realistically, a lot of people home educate for additional needs. So the money just isn't there.
Yeah. Well, that brings me nicely on to my last question. What should the Department for Education learn from home educators? And I know, again, it's a huge question.
It's a huge question. I feel really strongly that over the last, long time, it depends how many teachers you speak to, but a lot of the teachers I know who've kind of lost the love of teaching, it's because it's become too much box checking, it's too prescribed, there's too many, you're not given the freedom to educate the children how you think is best. And I know you know not everyone's going to get that right, but when we try to standardize education too much, I think it ultimately always ends up failing the majority. Because if we take an average of any group, you're always going to be letting down those who could have been stretched further, and you're going to be making it too difficult for those who wouldn't be able to achieve it. And so, we know that. That's where we have different grading options at GCSEs and at A levels and things. We don't just say pass or fail. We've got options, right? And the more standardized education is, the less appealing it is to the majority. And like I say, my daughter's found a school that she might be interested in now. That's because she found a school for autistic girls on Instagram. Now that's rare. Like, she has never wanted to attend school because she couldn't see a model for school where she felt like she could fit in and feel safe. Now that she's seen one, she's decided, actually, maybe I do want to go to school. If we are standardizing education, schools like that just don't exist, or at least they're incredibly rare.
Yeah.
What I would love the Department for Education to do is allow schools to differentiate and individualize more and create their own unique style and approach to education and culture, so that children can find the places that work for them and families can find the schools that are the right environment for them. Maybe it's a bit of a utopian idea.
No, but it happens in early years, in preschools. Exactly. You have, I mean, we're quite lucky in and around Leighton Buzzard that we've got Montessori preschools. Yeah. My children went to an absolutely fabulous Forest School preschool, and they spent from 12 o'clock every day outside in the woods.
Amazing.
And we had, and there's another preschool that's part of the school now that they attend, that's very much like school, and they're in uniform from the day they start there, and they go to assembly worship every day. And there's such a choice that you can find something that really suits your children and the what your family want from education. And if only the Department of Education could draw that,
right? That's not the majority of schools.
No, but if we can do it in early years, or if it can be offered in early years, then why can't it be offered?
And maybe it's biased, but I would love to see barriers to education for students removed. So even as we were talking, you were saying things like uniform from an early age. There's loads of kids for sensory reasons cannot wear school uniform. why don't we just remove it? Like,
Mm.
how does it prove what our learners are achieving, whether they're wearing a school uniform or not? I'd love to see much less focus on things that don't matter,
Unimportant.
that we
Yeah,
can
they're
prioritize the things that do, and we're
Yeah.
not setting up boundaries that are arbitrary for kids to fail with, particularly in large groups, because, you know, you're always seen as the odd one who can't do something if everyone else can do it. Well, if it's not a requirement that is important for your learning, can we just remove it? Why is it important that we do that? In the same way that, you know, if a student is really, really struggling with something, we have to go through an EHCP process to get them that support that they need. How about we just accept that the student is struggling and offering them some support? Do you need a medical diagnosis to support someone who's struggling with something? Or is it okay to just say, if they're struggling, we'll support you in this area until you're not struggling with it anymore? And that's something that I think in home ed is so much more readily available, because the EHC process is so long and children grow and develop at different times. And a student who really needs something today might not need it in 6 months or a year. But that flexibility of being able to individualize learning, it doesn't happen when classes are huge. And so, you know, even I'm nearly 40. I think the average class size when I was young was like 23. It was 25 was a big class. And I get it, funding, their class sizes get bigger and bigger, but I would love for the DfE to recognise that it is not sustainable for class sizes to just keep growing, and that children learn best when we keep those class sizes restricted, so that teachers can do what they do best, knowing their learners and supporting them the way they need to be supported.
Wonderful. Well, let's hope the DfE are listening today. I'll have to send them the link to this. Get listening. Amazing. Important. Right. Thank you, KJ, so much for coming on to Teachers Talk Radio, and so a really nice and interesting perspective on home education that lots of teachers and other home ed families might not necessarily have considered. All the best with the rest of your home education journey, and I hope that if your daughter goes to that school that she's picked, that she has a wonderful time there.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much, Holly. Lovely to speak to you today.
You too. Thank you. So that was KJ, and we're going to the news now and to hear from some other organisations that can help and support you as teachers. And then we'll be speaking to Amy, who is also a home educator and made her home education choices for slightly different reasons to KJ, and also brings some really interesting perspective to this conversation.
This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
If you're listening to this, then we know we share one thing in common: a passion for the type of outstanding education that every child deserves. That's what makes us the leading provider of specialist education and care. We need people like you to help us achieve even more. With us, you'll be given all the resources and support you need, offered a clear path to career progression, and be rewarded with some of the best salaries and benefits the industry has to offer. We are Witherslack Group. If you'd like to find out more, we'd love to hear from you. Visit www.witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers and be part of our future.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
With World Cup due to begin, TES magazine reveals why some schools won't be screening games during school time. The competition, held in Qatar, is the subject of much concern from some school leaders, worried about the ethics of showing games held in a country with a poor record when it comes to human rights. England play one game against Iran during school hours, but whilst many school leaders have chosen to show significant games in the past, some are choosing not to do so this time. FIFA's choice to host the tournament in Qatar has been controversial from the outset because of the country's laws on homosexuality and its treatment of migrant workers. Some heads have said that showing the game would be at odds with lessons on diversity and equality. Not all leaders share the same view, and some schools will show the game, but will have what is described as age-appropriate discussions about the ethics of the tournament alongside. Decisions of this nature are always left to individual school leaders, and as debate about the tournament continues, the only real certainty is that this World Cup will be remembered for its controversial hosts, if nothing else. The last week has seen many schools participate in activities to mark Anti-Bullying Week. To further acknowledge the impact bullying can have on young people and their families, the government's Education Hub has published an article laying out what they're doing to help combat bullying in education. This support has largely been in the form of government grants to fund projects and organisations who do important anti-bullying work. This has included further funding for the Diana Award, a recognised anti-bullying programme, the Anti-Bullying Alliance, a new programme to prevent and tackle bullying through quality RSHE education, the Anne Frank Trust to continue the different but the same project, diversity role models, developing intervention materials for schools, and Equaliteach to support multi-academy trusts or local authorities to create change. Full details of all the projects and the funding can be found on the .gov UK website, as well as in the Preventing and Tackling Bullying Guidance. The Scottish Government will launch an online national discussion on Scottish education the week beginning the 21st of November. Children, young people, parents, carers and teachers are being encouraged to take part by registering for events. Those who register will be able to talk directly to the independent facilitators, Professor Alma Harris and Professor Carol Campbell. The discussion was first launched in September, but in order to ensure as full a discussion as possible, the online events have also been launched. So far, the discussion has received 3,500 responses, and feedback will be open until the 5th of December. The Schools and Academies Show 2022 saw the Chair of Ofqual, Ian Buckham, discuss plans for exams and grading for 2023, as well as considering the future of exams, assessment and the use of technology. In his speech, he made it clear that exams and other formal assessments that are like exams give students the fairest chance to show what they know and what they can do. He cited feedback from students, parents and teachers, which he said was overwhelmingly positive, particularly about the return to normal exams in 2022 after the difficulties of the pandemic. Whilst exams in 2023 will see a return to pre-pandemic grading, safeguards will be put in place to ensure no pupil is disadvantaged. This will be the same as those put in place for the 2017 series when pupils sat the reformed GCSE and A-level qualifications for the first time. He went on to speak about the impact of digital tech and described it as when, not if, there would be a greater use of it in high-stakes exams. He did, however, acknowledge that a move to greater digital assessment can only come about through joint working across a range of partners and stakeholders, so as not to experiment with young people's futures. A full transcript of the speech can be found on the DFE website. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, this week I'm going to look at smartwatches. For those of you that don't know what a smartwatch is, it's basically a watch that has the ability to connect to your phone, enhancing the experience of the owner's smartphone by delivering notifications and controls via an interface, which shows more discreetly and allows the user to decide whether they need to get their phone out or not. This is a real bonus for teachers, as a lot of schools have no phones policies, making it difficult to be contacted during the day. Some smartwatches also can stand alone without the need for a short-range phone connection, as they've got built-in cellular or Wi-Fi capability, extending the range of connection, allowing the phone to be left at home. Although this can be useful, you need to bear in mind that there are additional costs for this, and answering calls makes you look like you're on an episode of Star Trek talking to your wrist unless you have headphones, and replying to texts can be tricky using the watch interface. That being said, one of the most powerful features of smartwatches is the ability to use contactless payment with them, a real time saver and also peace of mind. A downside of contactless payment using smart devices is some payment machines, in particular parking meters, only accept cards. This needs to be kept in mind when travelling around. So, what is the best? Well, that depends on the phone you currently have. It isn't really about the best, it's about compatibility. If you want an Apple Watch, you need to have an Apple phone. Android allows more options and also can be considerably cheaper. You need to ask yourself a few questions to decide what's best for you. Here are the questions I'd ask when considering a smartwatch. What do I want it for? If it's to see notifications from my phone, could an activity tracker be what I'm after? Compatible with all mobile phone platforms, there is a reduced control interface, but for around £50, alongside tracking your activity, you can see notifications without the need to get your phone out. What is the battery life like? Will it last until you get home to charge it? What's the display like? Will you be able to see it at a glance? What if you get messaged while pointing at a pupil's work? Will they see it? Can notifications be adjusted so you are not accidentally sharing? Is it noisy? Can you silence it? Can you switch it to vibrate? And finally, some phone contracts allow you to add on extra devices. Will it be cheaper to do it that way or to buy it outright? As always, I'd love to hear your favourite teaching tech. Do you wear a smartwatch? Let us know at TTR 2022. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio. This episode of Teachers Talk Radio has been made possible with support from Witherslack Group, the UK's leading provider of SEN education and care. They're here to support you too through an ever-growing offer of free resources, including webinars, podcasts, articles, and events aimed at supporting teaching professionals like you. Visit their website at www.witherslackgroup.co.uk to find out more.
If you're listening to this, then we know we share one thing in common: a passion for the type of outstanding education that every child deserves. That's what makes us the leading provider of specialist education and care. We need people like you to help us achieve even more. With us, you'll be given all the resources and support you need, offered a clear path to career progression, and be rewarded with some of the best salaries and benefits the industry has to offer. We are Witherslack Group. If you'd like to find out more, we'd love to hear from you. Visit www.witherslackgroup.co.uk/careers and be part of our future.
So, welcome back from the news and our wonderful sponsors. And the conversation continues. We are talking today about home education and what we as teachers and schools and even the Department for Education, what we can learn from this very passionate group of parents. And now we have Amy, who is also a home educator. Amy, welcome to Teachers Talk Radio.
Oh, thank you for having me.
It's lovely to have you. So why don't you start by telling us about your children and why home education suits your family?
Okay, so I have 3 children, 2 boys aged 8 and 6, and then a little baby. And I used to be a teacher. And then when my older son was born, I, for various reasons, ended up staying at home with him full time when he was little. And when we got to the point of deciding what to do with him, he has an August birthday and he really was not ready to start school at 4. So we thought we would just delay it a couple of years to just allow him a bit more time to actually physically develop. He wasn't there with all the skills he would need to get the most out of school. And then what we've done is, if we've got more into home ed as a lifestyle, as we've made friends in the community, we've just carried on because we're really enjoying it. So the things I think are really good for us. So firstly, I have very active little boys. So it's really great that they can have so much physical activity and time with their friends, time outside. and they can do everything through play, so that they're very play-based sort of approach. We can travel at their pace in all the academic subjects. So, for example, my older son took a bit longer to learn to read compared to my younger son. So my younger son learned to read like by magic at age 4, like I turned around and he could read. And my older son needed some structured support and got there at about 6.5. And my younger son, I think, would be frustrated because actually he would have gone into school already being able to read, and phonics would not have been a good use of his time. Whereas my older son would have found himself feeling behind because he hadn't learned to read sort of at 4 or 5. And they're both fluent readers now, very competent at it. So I feel like allowing them the time to move at the pace that was right for them and to use an approach that worked for them was really beneficial. I think the main thing, though, the reason we like it and the reason they enjoy it is it's time as a family. So they really would miss each other very much. They are they're best friends with each other. I love being with them so much. They love being with me and each other. And, I think if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's how fleeting life is and how quick things go by, time goes by. So, yeah. That's sort of a long answer.
No, well, that's great, and that's nice to hear. I'm always curious for when parents say, "Oh, I now home educate," or we are a home educating family, and they say that they are a teacher. Did that have any sort of did that contribute to your decision at all? Because being a teacher or being trained as a teacher, you have, a very good knowledge and understanding of teaching and learning. Or did that not really come into it? Was that something that you and maybe the other home educating families, that doesn't put anybody off from doing it?
So I do happen to know a lot of home educating families where particularly the mum used to be a teacher, just that's the way it's worked out. I actually think it's a bit of a mixed blessing. So I think being a teacher previously gave me the confidence to think, yeah, I can do this myself. But I think that's where the benefit ends, because actually what you naturally try and do is kind of put on to your home life the kind of approach that you used in a classroom. And they're completely separate environments in the sense that what works really well in the classroom becomes either irrelevant or unnecessary or even stressful in home life. And you have to work through a lot of questions yourself as a teacher. Like, this is what I used to do. Is this suitable for only 2 children that I know really well in this context? So let me just give you a classic example, would be like testing. So in a school classroom, testing is really important because you do not have time as a staff member to work around every child and ask them, can they do this particular maths problem, or can they have they learned this fact or whatever. So the only way you can manage the time is to get them all to sit a paper, and then you mark it afterwards, and then you get, that kid really didn't understand that, or that one's absolutely got it. Or the whole class did badly on that. I'm going to have to go over that. Oh God! But I don't need to ever run a test for my children because I know exactly what they can and can't do, because we talk about things all the time. So, can they work with money? Well, they'll look up, I want to buy this new Lego set that's come in and it's £24.99. They'll go and cut that money in the money box. And then we'll have a discussion about, we're only on £12. So how many more pounds do you need? And if they can't work that out, then clearly there's an issue there we need to work through. If they can work it out, they've cracked that. So there's no need to ever sit a test. So it's those kinds of things where what would work quite well in the classroom is not needed at home, just because you've obviously got only ever a small number of children who you can just have a conversation with. And it's tricky to unlearn that approach, because you naturally would be like, okay, and I feel like I need to do a worksheet on telling the time, whereas actually you could just live your life and say, oh, it's 10 to 3 and at 3 o'clock we're going to stop and do this. And they're like, how do I know what the time is right now, so I've got enough time? And then they'll learn to read the clock that way, so it's kind of,
so when it's like relevant and real life moments. Yeah. Okay, and I mean, I asked our earlier guest on the show about how home education manifests in her household, and one of my questions was about the space. Because I follow lots of these amazing home educating families on Instagram, and they've got these gorgeous like playroom come learning room, which none of them call schoolroom. And we spoke previously with my previous guest about the difficulties of not having a learning space. What does it look like in your household? What do you do?
So I think the main issue we have in terms of physical space is that they create a lot of stuff we can't find spaces for. So at the moment,
as a parent of 3, I can say that that's not exclusive to
I do keep saying that. Like, I'm sure they would do this anyway. But at the moment, they're really like drawing cartoons. They've been really inspired by a magazine we signed them up for and a visit to the Story Museum in Oxford. And so they really want to draw their own cartoons. So they spend quite a lot of time doing that. And obviously every drawing is precious because they took time on it. So what do I do with all these drawings? And they make crafts at various groups and then I don't know where to put them. So yeah, I don't have a lovely, beautiful storage solution, I'm afraid. And I don't have a schoolroom either. We are also like only about half the time in the house and half the time out.
I think that's a big misconception, isn't it? That home educating families are at home learning. It doesn't always happen at home, does it?
No, and I think the problem is that because everyone had a taste of kind of pandemic schooling, a lot of people have put that onto me and said, oh, that must be what you do. And I'm like, no, I do nothing like pandemic schooling. And I in fact found the pandemic incredibly stressful, being stuck like in my 4 walls with my children. So we definitely go out to lots of different things. So they attend a forest school, so they spend all day in the woods with friends doing crafts and activities and games. We do some things on Zoom. So we do French lessons over Zoom, and my older son does an inventors club. My younger son does music lessons, and we do gymnastics out of the house. And then I run, because I'm used to be a science teacher, so I run a science club for some local home ed families, and we all get together and spend about 2 hours playing and 20 minutes doing experiment.
Nice.
Nice to be together. So we definitely spend a lot of time with other children, which I think people who did the pandemic schooling don't appreciate, that because obviously you weren't allowed to. So people often say, oh, there's this big socialization problem. Well, there was in pandemic schooling, I can tell you, but there's not in home education. You've got plenty of opportunities to meet other families, and you could either do that just for sort of play and the social aspect, or you can do sort of classes. And certainly, I mean, in big cities, there's like, we could be, if I had the money, we could be at something every hour of every day. Just for home education groups and classes, and museums put on things and all of that. In terms of how I approach education with my children, so I'm very much kind of self-directed education with a little bit of structure through a Charlotte Mason inspired approach. So just to I learned all this vocabulary becoming a home educator. So self-directed education is the idea that the child can choose what they're interested in, and then you facilitate that as their educator. So my older son really wants to be an inventor. So we have facilitated that through signing him up for this inventors club that he can participate in. We collect various bits of cardboard and junk that he can assemble. We bought a glue gun. We allow him space and time to invent his things. He does a lot of inventing with Lego as well. And we allow him to watch kind of YouTube videos of people who've designed cool machines out of Lego that he can kind of look at copying or be inspired by. So that would be an approach that we would use across everything. So anything my children are sort of interested in, we would then be like, okay, can we dig into that and really sort of help you to meet that interest? And out of anything that you do comes a lot of learning. So Julie Bogart, who's like a home ed hero over in America, she says you can learn everything through anything. So inventing is like the anything, and we can learn everything through that, because he'll need to be drawing and writing and doing maths and measuring and calculating and then persevering. So like the character development that comes through that. So it didn't work and I'm going to tweak it and I'm going to try again. That kind of resilience that comes through that. So you can learn everything through anything, but it's not going to happen in a really linear fashion. And again, this is one of those differences between sort of a school approach and the home ed approach. Is the school approach is very thought through, like we need to do this before they can do that, before they can do this. That's what a curriculum is. It's a very carefully thought through program of how to do things. But if you go down a more sort of self-directed approach, it can be a bit random. So, you know, my kids could be doing something really quite complicated in maths before they've learned fractions or something like that, because the complicated thing is what they need right now, and the fractions is not needed for that thing that they're doing right now. So it tends to be a little bit kind of piecemeal. That doesn't mean it's incomplete. It just means that it's
a different approach, made to measure, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
made to measure. Yeah. It sounds wonderful. I whenever I talk to home educators and really talk to them, I'm very envious, and I think I would like to home educate my children, but also, in all honesty, I do enjoy having a little break from them when they go off to school, if I'm honest. And the constraints of having to work as well whilst they're at home, you know, for some families that must be really tricky. So what would you say are the major difficulties that home educating families and the community faces?
So you've picked up on some things that are tricky. So working is very tricky, particularly when the children are young, because you're giving them, to provide them with an education that's really facilitating all of those things, you have to be available. So some parents make it work by doing, if there's two parents, like they both work part-time maybe, so they've got different sort of times that they're off and able to help in the week, or they kind of flip the week round. So they do kind of like on a weekend is more like what we would see as kind of the school days, if I can put that in quotation marks, and they're really hands-on then, and then in the week they have a bit more kind of going out to friends' houses for the day or something. So it can work. There's a financial consideration as well. So, you know, we pay for a lot of the classes we attend, and obviously that is a financial cost. But the biggest one is that I don't earn a full salary. But the biggest difficulty, I think, is actually none of those things, because families can get around those things. The biggest one is actually an imposition on the community from local authority or from government, trying to impose a school approach onto home education, because they basically believe education is equal to school. And while you can get an excellent education at school, you can also get an excellent education without school, and those are not synonymous things. And so what tends to happen is we've seen an increase in local authorities being very suspicious of parents, being unaccepting of a parent's report when they report to the local authority and say, these are the things we've covered. The local authority are turning around and saying, prove it, essentially. So we're assumed to be guilty instead of innocent, and we have to kind of prove that we're doing enough to them. Our word isn't acceptable, and we fear that there's just more to come down the road. So there was a schools bill going through Parliament, which is now kind of dead, but it hasn't gone away, where they want to register. It
completely needs to go away, doesn't it?
Yes, yeah, it absolutely does. But it's bad for schools as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, bad for everybody. but most importantly, the children.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not done with them in mind at all. It's done with regulation and standardization in mind, rather than what's best for actual children. So they want to register all home educators, which sounds quite innocuous, but actually we know from things that have been said in meetings that this is the first stage in them wanting to impose monitoring and regulation onto home education. And if you come in and say you've got to follow this curriculum to be considered, you know, suitable in your provision as a home educator, you've essentially killed it dead. Because as I was saying just now, you know, the whole point is to tailor it to the child and to follow what their strengths and interests are and to support them in their weaknesses. And that means you're not going to walk a really neat line along the national curriculum, and coming in, imposing the national curriculum and testing children to make sure that they're in line with school children is just completely would take all the joy out of it actually, and put a lot of the benefits and the strengths of it would be taken away. Also, it's worth saying now that there's a lot of home educated children who have special educational needs, and that's often a reason that parents have chosen that route, because they weren't keeping up with the curriculum, and it was causing a lot of anxiety or even trauma for some children, because they felt so behind at school the whole time. Actually being able to relax and take things at the child's pace is the right thing for that child, and coming in saying, oh well, they're not at their age related standards is completely, it's not following the law actually, which is to take into account their age, ability, aptitude, and any special educational needs the child has. But because often the local authorities don't know the child at all, they just have a tick box approach. Can the child, a child in school age 6 is doing is this child doing it? It's not really trusting the parent and looking at what they've said and what their children can do. So yeah, that's why I say the greatest threat is to home education is an imposition of curriculum that takes away the fact that it's a tailored approach.
Well, that brings me really neatly and nicely onto my last question, which is, of course, what can the Department for Education learn from home educators? What do they need to know?
They need to know that education is not synonymous with school, that what works really well in school and can be a real benefit to the children there is not imposed easily onto the home for the same benefit. So I've already mentioned tests as an example, but curricula, worksheets, these are great tools for classrooms. They don't really work that well in the home, because you're having daily discussions about what's interesting to the child, where they're at, how you can move them forward. They're attending different things through the week that are at different places, and everything is educationally valid. And I think we can often fall into the trap of thinking the only education is like school subjects, but actually that's not the way the world works. If something breaks in my house, I'm going to have to either pay someone to come and fix it who's learned how to fix that device, or I could YouTube it and look up, see if I can do it myself, or I could look it up in a book or the internet. So the idea that school subjects are the only kind of learning that's going on and the only kind of learning we need for life is silly when we think about it, but we've sort of absorbed that into our...
I know it's a shame, and it's being so streamlined in schools, these days, particularly in secondary schools. It's not really very broad at all, is it?
And my brother's a very creative person. He's in the arts, and he often teaches in schools when he's not acting, and it's so great for those children to experience sort of that drama and music. They're really positive things, even if they don't end up being your career, for children, and they learn so much from it and gain so many skills. But because they're not the hardcore STEM or whatever, easily be judged as being somehow less in some way, when actually they're not.
Lovely. Well, not lovely, quite annoying and frustrating. But thank you so much for sharing your experience of home education. And I'm sure that all the teachers that are listening to this episode of Teachers Talk Radio will know other home educators, might be thinking about home educating their own children. Maybe they've got students in their class and the parents are thinking of home educating. And I'm hoping that listening to these really valuable experiences will give us all some really good food for thought. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today.
Pleasure.
Well, what a conversation we've had today. Very useful, interesting, and has got me thinking a lot about really what we do in the classroom, and maybe any adjustments that we might be able to make to really make education more enjoyable and accessible for all of our young learners. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for joining me on Teachers Talk Radio, and I look forward to seeing you next week on the morning break with me, Holly Kingmand.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.